The courtroom was silent, not the kind of silence that rests, but the kind that holds its breath. Jasmine Crockett stood motionless at the defense table, papers trembling faintly between her fingers. Her gaze never left the bench. Judge Richard Leon leaned forward, his voice deep and measured, cutting through the charged air. "Counselor, repeat that last line." No one moved. Reporters froze mid-scribble, cameras poised but forgotten. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to vanish beneath the weight of what she had just said. In that moment, Crockett's words replayed in every mind present. A sentence so deliberate, so fearless, it seemed to challenge the very architecture of power. The echo lingered like thunder trapped within marble walls. The judge's tone wasn't angry. It was astonished. Behind the bench, Leon's expression softened, respect, curiosity, and something unspoken flickering in his eyes. Across the aisle, the prosecution's lead attorney shifted uneasily, realizing too late that the balance of control had shifted. Crockett drew a steady breath. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of every silenced truth that had waited its turn in this chamber. "I said, Your Honor, justice doesn't bend for comfort. It bends for truth." A murmur rippled through the gallery. An elderly woman in the back pressed her hands to her heart. A young intern near the aisle whispered, "She really said that." Judge Leon's gavel hovered mid-air, suspended, symbolic, as if even authority itself needed a moment to absorb what had just unfolded. Crockett's eyes didn't flinch. They told a longer story of battles fought outside this room, of doors closed to voices like hers, of nights preparing arguments no one expected to hear spoken this boldly. And then, as if some invisible thread had snapped, Leon set the gavel down. "Proceed," he said quietly, almost reverently. The cameras resumed their hum, pens began scratching again, but the atmosphere remained electric, the kind that only follows a truth too big to fit neatly into protocol. No one yet knew what led to that moment, or why it would echo far beyond this courtroom. That morning, Washington didn't wake up, it tightened its tie. Every corridor of power gleamed under studio lights and hidden agendas. Outside the federal courthouse, the media swarmed like hornets, microphones raised, voices colliding. "High-stakes defense expected today," one reporter shouted. Another whispered to the camera, "Rumors suggest Judge Leon's patience is wearing thin." Inside, the air felt different, heavy with performance. The marble floors reflected the tension of a city that called itself just, but often chose convenience over conscience. Every suit in the room carried a side, not of law, but of loyalty. Jasmine Crockett stepped through the courthouse doors flanked by murmurs and camera flashes. Her stride was measured, confident, but her eyes betrayed awareness of who was watching and why. Behind her, aides whispered strategy. Ahead, opponents smirked, confident in their hierarchy. In the hall, an aide to the prosecution leaned to a colleague and said quietly, "She's good, but she's not one of us." The words weren't meant to be heard, but Crockett caught them. She smiled, a calm, deliberate smile that said more than any rebuttal ever could. By 10:00 a.m., the courtroom was full. The front benches brimmed with analysts and political influencers disguised as spectators. It wasn't just a trial. It was theater, a contest for narrative, not merely justice. Whispers spread about Judge Leon, too. Some said he'd grown weary of Washington's showmanship. Others claimed he secretly admired bold lawyers who still spoke like the Constitution meant something. Either way, everyone knew today's case, Crockett v. the establishment's comfort zone, was about more than precedent. It was about power, perception, and who gets to define both. As the hearing began, the prosecution opened with confidence, spinning polished rhetoric, citing regulations like scripture. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, safe, sterile. It was Washington's specialty, control through language. Then Jasmine rose. The subtle creak of her chair turned every head. The moment she began to speak, her tone broke the pattern, deliberate, rhythmic, unafraid to sound human. "Your Honor," she said, The truth doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. There was no objection, not yet, but the tension in the room thickened. Some looked impressed, others looked threatened. In that moment, the dynamic changed. What was supposed to be another predictable proceeding suddenly carried the pulse of something uncontrollable. Outside, social feeds erupted with clips and sound bites. "Who is Jasmine Crockett?" trended within minutes. Political pundits dissected her tone, her posture, her nerve. To some, she was too bold. To others, she was exactly what the country needed, a reminder that courage still belonged in the courtroom. And yet, beneath the spectacle, the unspoken tension simmered, the age-old battle between those who protect truth and those who protect position, between those who serve justice and those who serve power. Even Judge Leon felt it, that rare spark when the law stops being procedure and starts being principle. By the first recess, reporters had already rewritten their headlines. What began as a quiet hearing had become a test of character, hers, his, and the institution itself. No one knew it yet, but by sunset, one of them would regret underestimating her. For more than 3 decades, Judge Richard Leon sat at the intersection of law and legacy, a man both revered and feared in equal measure. His courtroom was not just a place of judgment. It was a monument to order, to hierarchy, to the belief that respect was something earned through obedience. Appointed in an era when compromise was still called weakness, Leon became known as a jurist who demanded precision, discipline, and deference. His sentences were long, his questions longer, and his silences, the kind that made even veteran attorneys lose their footing. Washington's insiders called him the Sentinel. Never swayed by tears, politics, or public outcry, his guiding creed, "The system doesn't bend. It is bent only by those too weak to uphold it." And yet beneath that granite composure, there was something deeper, a quiet hunger to be right, not just by law but by legacy. Every decision he made seemed to whisper the same question to himself: will history side with me? Over the years, Leon's rulings made headlines. He struck down regulations he deemed government overreach, chastised attorneys for emotional grandstanding, and famously told one young activist lawyer, "The Constitution is not a stage for personal theater." That clip went viral years later, mostly because Jasmine Crockett had been that lawyer's mentor. Still, the public's perception of him was layered. To the establishment, Leon was the embodiment of stability in a restless age. To reformers, he was the immovable obstacle, a wall of intellect and ego that kept progress politely waiting in the hallway. Even the press struggled to define him. The Washington Ledger once wrote, "He's the rare judge who can silence a senator and scold a journalist in the same breath, all while quoting Madison." The piece ended with a sentence that felt prophetic. But one day, the very order he protects may turn on him. His staff, loyal yet weary, described him as meticulous to a fault. He would rewrite his own opinions at 3:00 a.m., searching for a phrase that balanced judgment with immortality. But there was also rumor that he had grown cynical about the modern age. "These new lawyers," he once said to a clerk, "they chase applause, not truth." That cynicism became armor. He watched the nation's discourse unravel on screens and timelines, convinced that emotion had poisoned reason. So, when Jasmine Crockett's name appeared on his docket, a rising congresswoman turned defense counsel with a reputation for fiery idealism, Leon prepared himself for what he saw as a test of control. He'd seen her type before, he told himself. Charismatic, sharp, too political for the bench, too passionate for the law. He'd deal with her the same way he had with every idealist before, by letting the rules speak louder than her words. In chambers before the hearing, an old colleague joked, "You'll have your hands full with that one, Richard." Leon smiled dryly. "Then I'll use both." To him, the courtroom wasn't just about justice, it was a reminder of hierarchy. He saw it as sacred ground where order outlasted outrage. But that morning, Something shifted in the air before he even took his seat. Cameras glared a little brighter. The audience seemed restless, and when Jasmine stood, her calm presence didn't read as theatrical, it read as intentional. Still, Leon held firm. During opening arguments, he interrupted her twice, not out of hostility but instinct. He had learned to dominate the room before anyone else could. Yet with every interruption, Crockett grew quieter, not louder, more precise, not defensive. It unsettled him. He couldn't place it, but it reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years, the sensation of losing the rhythm of his own courtroom. By mid-afternoon, Leon's patience thinned. He leaned forward, fingers interlaced, as Crockett began citing a precedent he'd authored years earlier and turned it inside out, line by line. Her argument wasn't a rebellion. It was a mirror. Each sentence she spoke reflected the very contradictions he'd built his career trying to deny. The courtroom, once under his spell, now listened to her. A moment of flickering doubt crossed his face, so brief that cameras barely caught it. But in the hush of that chamber, something broke. It wasn't decorum. It was certainty. For the first time in decades, Richard Leon wasn't the unmoved arbiter of truth. He was the man being measured against it. And though he didn't yet realize it, this case, this woman, would mark the day his doctrine of control met its reckoning. Until today, when a single sentence would challenge everything he thought he knew about power. Before Jasmine Crockett ever stood beneath the vaulted ceilings of Washington's federal courts, she stood in a dim Texas library, tracing the cracks on the table where her first law textbook sat. The words blurred not from confusion, but exhaustion. She just finished a double shift waiting tables, her uniform still smelling faintly of coffee and grease. The librarian was closing up, but Jasmine wasn't done. She read through the echo of flickering lights, whispering clauses of the Constitution to herself like prayers. She didn't come from legacy. She came from labor, from a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who believed that dignity was earned by never quitting, no matter who tried to stop you. "The law ain't written for us, baby," her father once said, "but you can still make it listen." Those words became her compass. As a young law student, Jasmine learned early what it meant to be underestimated. Professors called her spirited when she was right, emotional when she was precise. In mock court, she once presented an airtight case on civil protections, only for a classmate to joke, "You should have gone into activism, not law." She smiled that day, but her notes from that trial had 3 words scribbled in bold ink across the margin: "Make them remember you." When she graduated, no firm came knocking. Her resume was spotless, her recommendations glowing, but her name, her face, didn't fit the quiet corridors of comfort where partners hired reflections of themselves. So she did what every underestimated person learns to do. She made her own space. Her first office was a one-room setup above a laundromat in Dallas. The air conditioner rattled louder than her phone ever rang. She took pro bono cases for tenants facing eviction, mothers fighting custody battles, and teenagers caught in a system that treated them as statistics. She wasn't chasing glory. She was surviving one brief, one client, one small victory at a time. But every case left a mark. Once, a public defender mocked her for objecting too passionately. "You'll never make it if you keep talking like that," he said. She didn't respond. Instead, she won the case, then walked past him in the hallway and whispered, "I'll make it talking exactly like that." Her rise wasn't cinematic. It was cumulative, years of sweat disguised as grace. Local journalists started noticing her wins, her discipline, her defiance of the unspoken rule that young black women in court must smile first and speak second. Soon, clients began showing up not because they could pay, but because they believed in her. When she entered politics, some said she was trading her law degree for a microphone. But for Jasmine, politics wasn't escape, it was expansion. It was the same courtroom, just louder, with higher stakes and brighter lights. As a congresswoman, she brought the same steel she had as a public defender: questions that cut, statements that struck truth like lightning. And yet beneath all of that fire, there was something quieter, a kind of fatigue that only those who fight every day for legitimacy can feel. She'd been mocked on talk shows, misquoted by pundits, underestimated by colleagues who confused her clarity for combativeness. But every slight became fuel. Every eye roll became another reason to show up sharper, calmer, more undeniable. One night, weeks before the Leon hearing, she sat alone at her desk, case files stacked like walls around her. A cup of cold coffee sat untouched. She read a line from one of Leon's past rulings, a decision that, to her, symbolized everything wrong with how power insulated itself. Her lips curved into a thin, knowing smile. "You like precision," she murmured to the page. "Then let's dance." It wasn't arrogance. It was preparation. Every word, every citation, every precedent was a brick in the cathedral she planned to build, not just a defense but a statement. She didn't just want to win. She wanted to be undeniable. When morning came, she dressed not like someone walking into battle but like someone walking into history. Her suit wasn't designer but deliberate, clean, sharp, dignified. As she walked up the courthouse steps, reporters shouted questions about strategy, optics, pressure. She said nothing, because this wasn't performance, it was reclamation. She carried within her the weight of generations who'd been told to sit down and wait their turn. Her every step echoed with the resilience of those who had no microphone, no title, no platform. In her silence was defiance. In her calm, control. Inside the courtroom, before Judge Leon even entered, she felt the eyes on her, skeptical, sizing her up, searching for a weakness. She felt them, acknowledged them, and let them fade into irrelevance. She knew why she was there. Because for Jasmine Crockett, the courtroom wasn't just about law. It was about visibility, the act of existing, unapologetically, in a space that wasn't designed for her but could no longer function without her voice. She remembered something her mother said after her first big victory. "Don't just win, Jasmine. Change what winning looks like." And so, when she walked into Leon's courtroom that morning, she wasn't there to win applause. She was there to reclaim respect. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that amplifies every rustle, every breath. Judge Richard Leon adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable, but the tightening of his jaw betrayed the irritation simmering beneath. "Counselor Crockett," he began, his tone sharp but measured, "are you implying that the statute as written is flawed?" Jasmine didn't flinch. She met his gaze with the same unyielding calm that had carried her through years of being doubted. "Not flawed, Your Honor," she said evenly, "just selectively interpreted. And history has shown us what happens when selective interpretation masquerades as justice." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The reporters scribbled faster. Across the aisle, opposing counsel leaned back, smirking, the confident smirk of a man convinced she had just overplayed her hand. Leon's pen tapped once on the desk. "That's a serious accusation, Counselor." "It's not an accusation," Jasmine replied, her voice cool as steel. "It's an observation, and I can support it with precedent." Each word landed like a strike. Her tone was precise, her phrasing surgical. She spoke with the restraint of someone who understood the power of timing, every pause deliberate, every glance controlled. The courtroom was no longer a room, it was a chessboard. Leon countered. "Precedent does not equate to proof. You're citing context, not law." Jasmine stepped closer to the lectern, sliding a folder open. "Then perhaps the law should remember its own context, Your Honor. Justice doesn't exist in a vacuum." He raised an eyebrow, a subtle challenge. The audience leaned in. For a moment, there was only the soft hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic click of her pen as she marked a line on her notes. Then she lifted her eyes again. "Respectfully," she said, "the court cannot demand obedience to a statute it refuses to interpret through the lens of fairness. The Constitution doesn't bend to convenience, even when power prefers it that way." The last line lingered in the air. The bailiff glanced nervously at Leon. Opposing counsel sat forward now, his smirk fading. Leon's reply came slow, deliberate. You tread dangerously close to questioning this court's impartiality, Counselor Crockett. Jasmine held his gaze, her voice softening not in submission but in control. I'm questioning nothing, Your Honor. I'm reminding. There it was, that moment where intellect met audacity, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Each objection that followed became a duel, one rooted in ego, the other in truth. Leon's baritone echoed through the room, sharp and precise, testing her footing, forcing her to adapt. But every time she countered not with aggression, but with logic so clean it cut deeper than defiance ever could. He objected to her citing a 1982 civil liberties ruling. She responded by connecting it to the very foundation of his own 1999 opinion, quoting his words back to him. The crowd reacted, quiet gasps, heads turning, whispers flitting across the benches. Leon's face betrayed the briefest flicker of surprise. She had studied him, his history, his style, his pride, and used it as a mirror. Still he pressed on. Counselor, I suggest you restrain your rhetoric. Rhetoric, Jasmine replied. No, Your Honor, just record. It was a subtle reminder that everything said in this courtroom would live beyond it, in transcripts, in headlines, in history. Leon leaned back, trying to reassert control. You seem to believe this case is larger than its scope. It always is, she said, because what happens here today will define the scope of who gets to be heard tomorrow. That sentence shifted the air. It wasn't loud, but it reverberated through the rows of journalists, through the interns in the back taking frantic notes, through the heart of a courtroom that suddenly felt too small for the weight of the moment. Admiration flickered in some faces, irritation in others. To a few she was brilliant, to others dangerous, but none could look away. Leon stared down at her for several seconds, his expression unreadable again. The tapping of his pen had stopped. He set it aside slowly. The tension was coiled now, tight, electric, waiting. Jasmine closed her folder, her movements calm, deliberate, her breathing steady. The duel had reached a fragile equilibrium, intellect meeting intellect, power meeting poise. And just when it seemed the courtroom might exhale, Leon spoke again. Counselor, repeat that last line. Jasmine lifted her eyes, her expression unwavering. The room stilled. Then came the line no one saw coming. Jasmine stood still, the weight of every eye pressing on her shoulders, the silence stretching just long enough to feel like forever. Judge Leon's voice had broken the air a moment ago. Counselor, repeat that last line. She could have faltered. She could have softened it, diluted it for comfort. But Jasmine Crockett didn't rise through half-broken systems by learning how to shrink. She inhaled slowly, steady, deliberate, then repeated, with the same precision and gravity that had first frozen the room. What happens here today will define the scope of who gets to be heard tomorrow. A murmur rolled through the gallery, the kind that isn't loud, but unmistakable, like wind rippling across tall grass. It wasn't just a statement. It was a verdict delivered to the conscience of the room. Leon's gaze didn't move. His lips parted slightly, then closed again, as though searching for a rebuttal and finding none. He shifted in his seat, the faint creak of the leather chair the only sound cutting through the silence. Jasmine continued, her tone now calm, deliberate, not a defense but a dismantling. Your Honor, she began, for too long the law has spoken loudest for those who already had a voice. It has echoed in marble halls and whispered through loopholes, but outside, where people wait for justice they can feel, not just quote, that voice fades. She turned, scanning the courtroom. Each pause was intentional, every sentence crafted like a blade wrapped in velvet. When a system demands reverence but refuses accountability, it stops being a guardian of justice and becomes a gatekeeper of privilege. That's what this case exposes. Not defiance, but imbalance. Leon adjusted his glasses, but she was already moving forward. "The law is not fragile," she said, "and truth does not collapse under scrutiny. If this court is as impartial as it claims to be, then fairness isn't an insult, it's an obligation." Her words struck with surgical precision. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. Power had a new timbre, and it sounded like control. Across the room, opposing counsel, the same one who'd smirked hours earlier, had gone perfectly still, his pen frozen midair. A junior clerk near the back blinked rapidly, unsure if she was witnessing bravery or blasphemy. Jasmine took a single step closer to the bench. "You asked if I believe the statute is flawed," she said softly. "I believe it's incomplete, because justice evolves, it must. The founders gave us the words, but it's on us to give them meaning. Otherwise, they're just relics dressed in reverence." Her gaze was steady. If precedent can't grow, it decays. And if the court refuses to see that, then it's not preserving the law, it's preserving itself. The last line hung in the air like smoke. For the first time, Leon didn't respond immediately. His hand hovered near his gavel, but he didn't reach for it. His posture stiffened, yet something in his eyes betrayed the faintest recognition, not defeat, but the discomfort of reflection. Then a voice from the back, a spectator barely above a whisper, "She's right." It was enough. Enough to ripple through the crowd. Enough to remind everyone that power only feels untouchable until someone dares to speak truth to it, clearly, cleanly, without apology. Jasmine continued, not breaking stride. "Every courtroom claims to honor equality before the law, but equality without empathy is theater. It's performance justice, meant to be seen, not felt. We can do better than that." Her voice grew softer now, not fiery but human, the kind of tone that slips beneath armor. "I stand here, not as someone looking for confrontation, but as someone refusing to pretend that silence equals respect. I was taught that the measure of a nation isn't how it treats the powerful, it's how it listens to the unheard." A man in the front row lowered his head, whispering to the woman beside him. A reporter's camera light blinked red, recording every syllable. And still, Leon said nothing. So Jasmine pressed on. "I respect this court," she said. "I respect your years on this bench, your honor, but respect doesn't mean obedience. It means honesty, even when honesty shakes the room." A single bead of sweat traced the side of Leon's temple. He was composed, but his stillness spoke louder than movement. Jasmine placed her final document on the lectern. "If we can't challenge the discomfort that truth brings," she said quietly, "then we've turned justice into ceremony." She looked up, her voice steady, but now carrying a note of solemn finality. "And maybe that's what today is really about. Not just this case, but whether courage still has a place in rooms like this." Then she stopped, no dramatic flourish, no raised tone, just silence. It was the kind of silence that demands to be felt. The audience seemed suspended in it, the air too thick to breathe, every emotion hanging heavy and unsorted. Some faces glowed with admiration, others tightened with resentment. And then movement. Leon finally leaned forward, his elbows on the bench, eyes narrowing slightly as if searching for weakness in her words. But there was none. "In a city," the narrator's voice would later echo, slow and cinematic, "where words are currency," hers bought back truth. What followed wasn't chaos. It wasn't applause. It was the quiet understanding that something had just shifted, not only in that courtroom, but in the air of a city long accustomed to performance over principle. Opposing counsel exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. The clerk blinked, glancing toward the judge for direction. Leon's gavel remained untouched. Outside, beyond the marble doors, the media's microphones were waiting. They didn't yet know they were about to replay her words on every feed, every timeline, every loop, the moment the room froze. Back inside, Jasmine gathered her papers, her hands steady now. The tremor that had once hinted at nerves was gone. She didn't look for approval. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. Her message had already landed, immovable. And as she stepped away from the lectern, that lingering echo, the one no microphone could capture, hummed through the walls. Conviction. The court reporter, still typing, looked up briefly, almost in awe before lowering her eyes again. Leon spoke finally, but his voice had softened, even if only slightly. "Counselor Crockett, your remarks are noted." She inclined her head respectfully, but said nothing. The camera light blinked once more, capturing the exact moment when composure met courage, and courage won. Outside the frame, history had already begun to write itself. The courtroom didn't applaud. It didn't need to. The sound of her final words still lingered when the clip hit the internet, first as a 12-second snippet, then as a storm. Within an hour, the phrase was trending: "Crockett defends truth." By noon, it had evolved. Her words froze the room. Justice spoke back, and simply Jasmine. The video spread like a pulse through every corner of social media. Political accounts dissected it frame by frame. Activists reposted it with captions like, "This is what strength looks like." And ordinary viewers, teachers, students, veterans, nurses, wrote long, heartfelt comments about how, for the first time in a long time, they felt seen in a courtroom they'd never entered. Cable news caught up next. The screens flickered from one network to another, anchors speaking in that breathless tone, reserved for moments when the story outruns the script. "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's courtroom defense went viral overnight," said one. "An unexpected rebuke of institutional arrogance," said another. Clips of Judge Leon's frozen expression replayed again and again, slow motion, zoomed in, color graded for dramatic effect. Commentators speculated what he was thinking, whether he felt challenged or changed. Late-night hosts weighed in too. One joked, even the gavel was afraid to interrupt her. The audience roared. Another called it the most respectful mic drop in legal history. And somewhere in Washington, a senator who'd once dismissed her as too emotional for serious debate quietly deleted an old tweet. The momentum built like a drumbeat. A podcaster in Atlanta broke down the speech line by line, calling it a manifesto for modern justice. A news outlet in New York compared her tone to Thurgood Marshall's early court battles, poised, factual, fearless. Meanwhile, international headlines picked it up with their own spin. Young U.S. lawmaker redefines the language of power. But not everyone was applauding. Her critics, those who thrived on decorum without depth, scrambled to reinterpret her words. Some called it grandstanding. Others labeled it a political stunt. One columnist claimed she weaponized grace. Still, even the backlash fed the wave. Every critique replayed her clip. Every rebuttal shared the same soundbite that kept echoing across timelines. The law is not fragile, and truth does not collapse under scrutiny. People couldn't stop quoting it. It became a caption, a t-shirt, a tweet pinned to millions of profiles. In classrooms, debate students analyzed it. In offices, coworkers watched it during lunch, shaking their heads at the calm conviction in her voice. One clip showed a group of law students gathered around a phone, someone whispering, "That's the standard now." Meanwhile, talk shows brought on panels. One legal analyst said, "It wasn't defiance, it was discipline. She didn't shout, she didn't fold, she just stood taller." And another added, "The brilliance was that she didn't argue against the system. She argued for its promise. That's why it hit so hard." Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, not massive protests, but quiet clusters holding handmade signs. "Justice deserves courage. Truth has a voice. We heard her." For Jasmine, the noise reached her long after she left the courtroom. She was in a quiet car, staring out at the gray DC skyline, her phone lighting up every few seconds. Friends, colleagues, strangers, all sending the same message. You did it. You made them listen. But she didn't smile yet. Not fully. She knew the real weight wasn't in the applause, it was in what came next. Because for every person cheering, there was someone waiting to challenge her again. Every viral moment creates its shadow, and she'd learned to live in both light and consequence. The next morning, the country's most watched political show aired a segment titled The Crockett Moment, when dignity redefined power. Clips of her speech played behind the anchor as the voiceover said, "In a divided nation, one woman reminded everyone what conviction sounds like." The narrator paused. Not loud, not angry, just unflinching. The segment closed with a shot of Judge Leon, still at his bench, silent, frozen in that exact frame where her words landed. It wasn't mockery, it was reverence. The stillness told a story that analysis couldn't, the look of a man confronted not by disrespect, but by truth itself. By evening, Leon's name was trending too, but not for the reasons he was used to. People were asking, would he respond? Would he double down or rise to meet the moment she created? Pundits called it the beginning of a reckoning. The first time in years a courtroom had become a symbol of something greater, not division, but dialogue. And as dusk settled over Washington, Jasmine's words still echoed through the country, from living rooms to lecture halls, from scrolling phones to whispered conversations. If the court refuses to see, then it's not preserving the law, it's preserving itself. It had become more than a soundbite, it was a mirror. But the story wasn't over. Because somewhere in the stillness of his chambers, Judge Richard Leon sat replaying the hearing footage, again and again, leaning closer each time, as if trying to find the exact moment he stopped hearing argument and started hearing truth. He paused the video, exhaled, and whispered, to no one in particular, "She made her point." The screen faded to black, and the world leaned forward, waiting. But the story wasn't over because Judge Leon wasn't done listening. Courthouse was empty now, echoes of footsteps fading into marble silence. Judge Richard Leon sat alone in his chambers, the weight of the day pressing heavier than the gavel in his hand. The same bench that had once symbolized control now felt like a mirror reflecting something he hadn't seen in years: humility. For decades, Leon had believed that authority was justice. That order kept chaos at bay, and that experience meant wisdom. But her voice, calm, unyielding, sincere, had unsettled something in him. Not his pride, but his certainty. He leaned back, eyes on the faint glow of the city through his window. Washington looked different tonight, quieter, as if it too were listening. He played the recording again. Jasmine Crockett's voice filled the room. No outrage, no tremor, just truth, delivered with the precision of someone who had carried it for years and finally found a place to set it down. The law is not fragile, and truth does not collapse under scrutiny. He froze the playback on her face, the steadiness in her eyes, the courage in her stillness. Somewhere in that silence, the walls of hierarchy began to crack. The next morning, when court resumed, Leon's demeanor was different. Still firm, still measured, but something had shifted. When Jasmine entered the courtroom, their eyes met not as adversaries, but as equals on opposite ends of the same fight for meaning. When he spoke, the tone was almost reverent. "Counselor Crockett," he said, "the court thanks you for your argument and your composure." It wasn't a grand apology, not even close. But in Washington, respect rarely arrives with a fanfare. Sometimes it's a single word delivered with the weight of 1,000 unsaid ones. And that word, thanks, landed with more sincerity than any verdict he had ever given. Outside the courthouse, reporters speculated about the change in tone. Commentators debated whether it was strategy or conscience, but those who were truly listening knew better. It wasn't politics, it was recognition. Because in that moment, the old guard and the new voice of justice had found a bridge, not built from agreement, but from acknowledgement that truth, when spoken with courage, commands respect even from those who once dismissed it. That night, Leon wrote a brief entry in his private notes. "Integrity doesn't shout, It simply stands and the room listens. He closed the book, turned off the light, and let the silence say what words could not. Meanwhile, across the city, Jasmine Crockett sat with her team in a dimly lit diner. Phones buzzed with congratulations, but she barely glanced at them. She wasn't chasing headlines. She was chasing something far quieter, far harder to earn, respect that lasts beyond applause. As she stirred her coffee, someone at the counter turned, recognized her, and simply said, "You made us proud." She smiled, a small, tired smile, the kind that comes from knowing you didn't just win an argument, you shifted a conversation. The narrator's voice returns, calm but powerful. In a country divided by noise, one courtroom found silence, and in that silence it found truth. Respect isn't given to power. It's earned through courage, through clarity, through the refusal to bow when the moment demands you rise. The scene cuts back to Leon, alone again, staring at the empty bench. Then to Jasmine, walking out into the soft evening light. Two figures worlds apart and yet somehow aligned. A closing whisper carries through both spaces. And sometimes the loudest sound in justice is silence. The music swells, not triumphant but deeply human. But her words didn't just move a judge. The narrator continues, voice tightening into conviction. They awakened a country, reminding America that truth, once spoken, never echoes the same way twice. The screen fades back to that same courtroom, still frozen in time, Judge Leon motionless, the audience breathless, and Jasmine Crockett's words hanging in the air like something sacred. Her statement hadn't just silenced the room. It had thawed something far deeper, a truth America had forgotten how to feel, that courage doesn't always roar, and brilliance doesn't always need permission to speak. Narration softens, intimate yet resolute. Her words froze the audience, but they thawed something deeper in America. Clips of headlines flash, Crockett's stand goes viral, Judge Leon's unexpected respect, truth wins quietly. Then tweets, comments, messages from students, veterans, young lawyers, single mothers. Ordinary people writing, "I felt seen." Because this wasn't just a courtroom story. It was a mirror reflecting what happens when intellect stands up to ego, when grace dismantles arrogance, and when truth, no matter who speaks it, demands to be heard. As the music swells, the narrator's tone sharpens with quiet defiance. If brilliance still matters, if respect still means something, then share this story. Because somewhere out there, another voice is waiting to be heard, and maybe, just maybe, your share is the spark that gives it courage. The logo flickers in. Shadow State, bold, cinematic, relentless. You're watching Shadow State, where power meets truth. Final line, a whisper beneath the fading score. Because every silence deserves to be heard. The music fades, leaving only the echo of Crockett's last line, the one that started it all. A pause. Then blackout.